So on page 205 in your book, they start going over in Chapter 5 web design. Again, we will have a written test on this, but there will be nothing in here on your actual hands-on test. All right? So they talk about site organization in here. A lot of the stuff that's in this chapter, you may or may not agree with this, but it pretty much is common sense. All right? For instance, they talk about designing for your target audience. The picture that's here is different than the one that's in your book. But as an example, if I'm creating a website for senior citizens, I shouldn't have real bright popping colors. I probably won't even want to have very many graphics because most seniors are used to sites that are more text-based. Okay? If I write a site for little kids, I want it to be very bright with vivid colors and have as little text as possible and as many pictures as possible. All right? And, for the rest of us that are somewhere in between there, you should always, as it says, be designing for your target audience. So your target audience is the people who will most often come to your site. All right? Now, it's hard because when you think about it, think about Amazon. You say, well, they don't even have a target audience. They actually do. They do demographics as much as they can. And my guess is it's probably people between like 18 and 39 do most of the purchasing there. That would be my guess. It would be some kind of a demographic like that. So they set their website up so that it works best for that demographic. Okay? But if you look on the bottom of page 206, as opposed to the thing in the middle, the thing on the bottom doesn't have, there are no pictures in it. All right? It's just all text. All right? And that's typically what people, that especially as I said, as they get older, like to look for. All right, website organization. Hierarchical, linear, and random. Virtually every kind of website that you see out there, virtually every one is hierarchical. Just so you know that. We'll talk about all three of these on the next couple pages, but virtually every one that's out there is hierarchical, meaning you'll have something like this. All right? And what that means is there's some semblance of order. So in other words, I don't like the way that this is actually shown because technically home is over here by about and everything else. All right? But products would have 2 pages underneath it, 2 different category pages. So the idea is when it's hierarchical, as it says, it's characterized by a clearly defined home page and links to the other main pages. That's the way most of them are. What you don't want to do is what's shown here. This is on the bottom of page 207 in your book. You don't want to use chunking, where from your home page, you go out to 57 other pages. It's just too hard for people. You really, off of your home page, probably a really good number is about 7. You probably won't want many more pages than, many more things, home, about, etc., more than like 7 of those. All right? There is a whole principle, the idea of 7s. You maybe have heard of that before, you maybe never have, but even they talk about when you write a PowerPoint. Any PowerPoint slide should never have more than 7 thoughts on it because people just can't handle that. All right? And the same thing goes here. The opposite of chunking, because so you can chunk going across, but you can also chunk up and down. Okay, I'm asking you a question here. And if you read this, you know the answer, but let's say you didn't read it. How many clicks do you think that you should have to make to be able to get to anything on a website? The answer is 3. Now, that's not always feasible. Some websites, the material is buried so deep that you can't do it in 3. But you should always strive. They call that the 3-click rule. That, again, the idea is you should be able to get anywhere on a website you want with no more than 3 mouse clicks. I said sometimes that's a little pie in the sky. You want to be able to do that, but it's very hard, if not darn near impossible, to do it. But that's what you should always strive for. That makes your website as easy to iterate or for people to get around in as possible. All right? All right. So the next one that's there is a linear organization. That's do this, then do this, then do this, then do this, then do this. Maybe you've done this at one time or another in your life when you've gone out to a website, and on the website is basically a big tutorial on how to do something. So they show you a screen on how to do something, and then there's like a next button. You click and you go to the next screen, etc. That's a linear organization. That's typically where they're used. If you've got a website that more or less is like a tutorial type of thing, that's most often how they're used. All right. Then finally, there's a random, where there's no clear path. Let me ask, anybody in here ever see the movie? It's a few years old now, with Tom Hanks called Big? Okay, in that movie, he's a little kid, and he and his friends, they go by this amusement park. And there's a thing in there, you put a quarter in, you push a button, you like click a thing, and you can make a wish. He says, I wish I was big. Okay? He wakes up the next day, and he's like a 30-year-old guy working at, and he's got to get a job and whatever. I know a little goofy to think about, but just play with me for a minute. The idea is he gets a job with an ad agency, and he's got a unique perspective because he looks at things through the mind of a child. All right? So why am I telling you this? One of the things he comes up with is the idea of an interactive comic book, where you can go down different paths, and when you're in a certain path, you can choose to go this way, or you can choose to go that way. That's random organization. When there's no clear path. All right? When you can get to wherever it is you want to go in multiple different ways. All right? So that's the difference between the three of them. All right, principles of visual design. Repetition. Repeat visual components throughout the design. The idea is, you may or may not be aware of this, but for example, this is a thing I'm doing for another class, so don't worry about it, it's not your class. But Microsoft products typically have file on the left-hand side, and they have help on the right-hand side. In fact, Microsoft years ago, give credit where it's due, they wrote a book on how to write a Microsoft menu, and people actually bought it. All right, why? Because they wanted their menu structure to look like Microsoft's, because that was a menu structure people were already familiar with. Does that make sense? In much the same way, when they talk about this, it says when applying the principle of repetition, you repeat one or more components throughout a page and or throughout a site. All right? And they say, for example, photographs are displayed using similar colors. All right? Different things that you put on a page have similar shape and format. Okay? There's all sorts of ways that you can do this. If you don't want to do that, then you might apply contrast, where you emphasize differences. All right? Most people think of what's the biggest contrast? Black and white, right? Having white text on a black background or black text on a white background. But there's a lot of ways that you can do contrast. There are certain colors, if you go out, I gave you that thing about, on the last test, about, different colors that go together. There's also different colors that are the opposites of one another. And sometimes people like to do that for effect. Proximity. If you turn up to page 210, grouping together related items. Now, if you look on the screen here and you look at that picture, Casita Sedona on page 210, that picture may not look like it's very important right now, and it isn't. But what we'll want to do eventually is when we start taking the size of our screen and making it narrower, so it would be the way that it would look on a phone, this is going to be too wide. So we're going to want to change the way our layout is on the screen, depending on the type of medium we're using to look at it. So just keep that in mind. It's something we'll be doing later. But as it says, related items are placed physically close to one another. Unrelated items shouldn't be next to one another. All right? Alignment. Align items to create visual unity. You typically want to set things up so that the user isn't going like this, where they're all over a page. I may have mentioned this in an earlier class. I may not have. Red is the hardest color on the central nervous system. If I was doing a site for people who are schizophrenic, I wouldn't make my background red. All right? That kind of thing. All right? All right. Then they give you some tips as far as design to improve accessibility. And it says in Chapter 1, you were introduced to the concept of universal design. Let's take a closer look at it. And they're saying in here, you can read these yourselves. I don't want to read them to you. But the idea is everyone in here has got their own differences on page 211. And they say that each one of those types of people would be able to benefit from accessibility in mind. One person is deaf. All right, one person. Another big thing, it may not sound that big, but touchscreens have become a blessing to a lot of people. Because if you're arthritic, being able to use a mouse is very difficult. All right? But touchscreens are much nicer for that. So they mentioned accessibility design on the bottom of 211 can benefit. A lot of times it'll get you a better search engine listing, something we'll call SEO that we'll go over in a later chapter. It's the right thing to do. The idea is you want to make life as simple for people as possible using your site. They talk about this principle that's called POUR, P-O-U-R, on the bottom of page 211 and going on to page 212. It says your content must be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now, there probably is going to be a question on your next written test. What are the 4 components of POUR? And you'll have to remember those 4 words. I don't know. I haven't looked at your test yet. I'll let you know that tomorrow. But the bottom line is this, and I think I've said stuff like this before, but if I decide I'm going to open up Jeff's Sporting Goods so I can compete with Dick's, all right? What I don't want to do is take something and make it so hard for people to look at, all right? For instance, you might find it's really cool if I had like a basketball, let's say it looked almost 3D that it came at you. So the first time you saw it, well, that's cool. I guarantee you, after seeing it 2 or 3 times, it would be a pain in the butt, and you wish it wouldn't be there. Those are the kind of things that you have to think about, all right, as a web designer. All right, for writing for the web, again, much of this is common sense. Organize your content. People like to be able to scan a website very quickly. That's why you have things like H2 and H3 tags on there, because you can have a tag that explains what down below it is. If they look at it and it says, organize your content, and I don't care, now I know I can skip that stuff. And I can go on, and if I want, choosing a font, that's important to me. Now I know by that heading, that's something I want to read. All right? There are also fonts that are really hard to read. Okay, I think we looked in here on one day at Google Fonts very quickly. All right, some of those Google fonts are really hard for people to read. All right. Be real leery of font size and font weight. Fonts display different on different types of machines. Again, if I am writing for people that I know are elderly and I'm going to use a lot of text, I might want to make my font a lot bigger. Does everybody know that you could hold down on your control key, literally on your control key, and you take your mouse and you do the wheel, and you can make that bigger and smaller, if you see on the screen here? All right. Well, even that might be considered too hard. I'll tell you what, my dad's 89. He could not do that. He just couldn't. He's got a lot of physical limitations. So you want to make it, know your audience and make it as simple for them to use as possible. Font weight. One of the things that's overdone way too much on websites, people bold too many things. But I had to bold it. It was important. Then you realize half of your page is bolded. Believe me, you see that. You should really just bold things that you want to stand out. All right, font color contrast with the background. They give you some websites on the bottom of 213 that you can look at. Line length. One thing that people, notice our author did a good job. She uses white space in here. I think you'd agree with that, at the top, bottom, and on the sides. All right, if you jam everything together, that's what it looks like. All right, that's why I think it's 10% of your grade, and we won't talk about this for a few weeks yet, but when we start talking about the digital portfolio that you're going to create at the end of the semester, that's one of the things I look at. If your page is 100% filled up, and there's no white space anywhere, all right, you get taken off because it's too hard for people to read. Alignment, as it says, centered text is more difficult to read, believe it or not. Why would centered text be harder to read? Because you're used to reading left to right. That's half of it. The other half is when you center, unless you've got it set center justified, your lines are going to be of different sizes, and you're kind of going like this as you're reading. All right. Text and hyperlinks, again, don't underline complete sentences. Maybe I think one or two of you have come up to me this semester too, and you've said, "Look at this, my whole thing is underlined almost." That's because you had an opening A tag and you didn't have a closing A tag. All right. Reading level. You may or may not be aware of this. Most textbooks, like the one you have here, what grade level would you guess they're set up for if you had to guess? Not somebody can guess.
After high school?
No, 8th grade. That's what most textbooks are set up for, is 8th grade. And part of the reason for that, whether they admit it or not, is they've done studies and they found out that there are many people who are in college. I'm not saying it's any of you, but there are many people who are in college, that's their reading level. All right, they may be peaked there or whatever. All right, now that's not going to be the same for a medical textbook. All right, but for this one it probably is. And as they mentioned, there's even a site called juicystudio.com that will look at all your verbiage and it'll say who it's made for. If I know that I've got a website I'm making for kids, I'm going to want to run it through there. Because if it says 8th grade reading level and I'm trying to get 7 and 8-year-olds, that's too high. Right? Spelling and grammar. Another thing that's important in here that you may or may not know of are dead links. There's nothing worse on a website, nothing more amateurish than having a link that somebody clicks on and it doesn't go anywhere. You should always, if you are a person working on websites, you should always be checking your links on a regular basis, especially if you're linking out to somebody else's site. All right. Use of color. Do you want to base it on your images? Do you want to use a color wheel? They go through a bunch of this stuff in here. Colors that go together kind of in the same color wheel. Colors that are complementary, colors that are just the opposite of one another. So there's a lot of different ways that you can set this up. All right, there are so many sites that are out there, and this is 215, 216, and 217 in your book. All right. Accessibility in color, as I mentioned to you, approximately 10% of the world is colorblind. So you don't want to use a background color that's too close to your text color. Again, I can read that, and probably you can. There are many people that's very hard to read. All right. So they say choose background and text colors with a high amount of contrast. And there are plenty of sites out there that you can look at that will gauge that for you. Again, there's for children. You notice the graphics. All right. It says many teens and young adults like darker colors, and many adults like more text. All right. In fact, they show you that senior moments on the bottom of page 219. Here, this was from the old book. They used Medicare.gov. But the ideas are pretty much the same. All right. Graphics and multimedia. We're almost done. In here, starting on page 220. Going on, I guess, to the next page or so. A little longer chapter than I thought it was. They talk about anti-aliasing. This will make its way on to your written test. I can guarantee it. So notice the difference. when something is anti-aliased, it doesn't have that rough edge look to it. So you might look and say, well, geez, I'm going to always make my stuff anti-aliased. It looks better. Not on every site. All right. So they define anti-aliasing on the bottom of 220 and the top of 221. It says it introduces intermediate colors to smooth, jagged edges in digital images. All right. More design considerations on the bottom of 221. Load time. We already talked about this. Ideally, and this is a thing to remember. I'm not saying it's on a test, but this is a thing to remember. Any web page that you create, ideally, is no more than 60 to 65K in size, because those will load pretty quickly. Once you start putting in really ornate images and stuff and it gets real big, it's going to take a lot longer to load. And that's what they mention on the bottom of 221, and they give you a little chart on 222. All right. All right. I should have brought my newspaper with me this morning because I got it in the other room, but I don't have it. And if you've ever seen this, if you've got a newspaper, a lot of times they come folded in half, right? And the halfway point, everything that's above that, that's called the fold. Typically, you put the most important part of your website on the fold. And that's important because if somebody has a screen that's a typical size, you know, maybe I've got it where it looks like this. So I don't want to have to go down to see something. I want the most important stuff to be on the top. And that's exactly what the author is talking about there with above the fold. White space. All right, white space are blank spaces. They're tabs, hitting the enter key, etc. Horizontal scrolling on page 223. Never, ever, ever on a website make people scroll to the side. Just don't do it. Most people don't even realize that they can do it. Vertical scrolling is considered totally acceptable. Horizontal is always unacceptable. Remember again that your site will look different on different browsers. We've talked about that before. Your site will look different on different screen resolutions. All right, and as we finish up the chapter here, we are getting there. All right, like I said, this chapter is longer than I thought it was. Ease of navigation. Well, one thing about that, if you're going, you know, some people decide that when they do this, when they make a navigation bar, if you look up on the screen here, if it's on the top, it should always be on the top. Sometimes people, for whatever reason, put it on the bottom. It used to be in vogue to put it on the side, but whatever way you do it on one page, do it like that on all pages. Again, that you say, well, that's just common sense. Yes, it is. Some people do use graphics for navigation. Remember, that's going to be hard for people who can't see. So if you're going to do that, always provide another way for them to be able to get around a site. Skip repetitive navigation. All right, if there's already a thing in here that says content on it, don't make a skip to content on there. All right, dynamic navigation. Some people like it when things appear and disappear or are colored or not colored, etc. Some don't. A site map, if you've never seen one before. Now they show an example here in your book on page 226 at the bottom of the page. The key thing though is that is a site map that's along the sides. Most site maps today, not all, most site maps, if you're going to have one, are at the bottom of the screen. All right? You don't have to do it that way, but still, that is the way that most people tend to do it. There's no rule that says you have to do it that way. It's just that's the way most people do it. All right. Web page layout design. This is a wireframe. It's not a great wireframe because this wireframe supposes that there are no pictures at all on the page. It's saying you're going to have a header. This is your navigation. This is your content area. There's your footer area. All right? But let's face it, quite often you're going to have graphics. So typically they look more like this. With a wireframe, it's almost as though you sat down with paper and pencil and just sketched out what it'll look like. All right? But you're giving, a lot of times what you do is you present this to a user so they know what it is. You know, hey, this is the way I plan on setting it up. If you don't like something, now's the time to tell me. That kind of an idea. Page layout design techniques. Again, these will find their way onto a test, my guess is. This is on pages 229 and 230. A fixed layout, also known as a solid or ice design. It has a fixed width. So if you notice on here, even if you make your screen bigger or smaller, it's always this size. Okay, and if you say I've never seen it, yes you did. Remember how I set on the website I did for you, how I set the width, you know, of the of main to be like 700 pixels? It's always that size, whether I make it bigger, whether I make it smaller. There's also a fluid layout on the bottom of the page here. It's the bottom of 229, and as the author mentioned, it's also called liquid. The idea is it takes up 100% of the screen, no matter how wide or narrow the screen is. All right, that can be a little funky sometimes. And if you look here at the example that's on page 230, the only way they could do that here was to put some coloring in here. All right. All right. All right, 3 or 4 more pages and we're done. Design for the mobile web. Again, starting in the middle of 2015, more people today use the internet for whatever, using mobile devices which are defined to be phones and tablets than do desktops, all right, and laptops. That's why the approaches, you can either develop a mobile site or you can have a separate site targeted for mobiles, or you can use responsive design. That's what we're going to be getting into, is more responsive design. Small screens. What's the biggest problem with using my phone for everything? The screen size is one, I would say. The other one is it's got limited life. I mean, I haven't done hardly anything today, and I'm at 89%. So it's already used 11%. And if I don't know if you're like me, but during the day I'll occasionally check things on here. Most of the time when I get home, I haven't even done hardly anything on here. Now, this is a Galaxy 5, so it's a little older, and it's the original battery. But I'll be down at 30, sometimes 25%. All right. You've got less bandwidth, etc. And they show you some of the mobile design considerations: smaller screen size, low bandwidth, font color issues, awkward controls if you got fat thumbs. All right. Functionality can be harder, etc. They give you a checklist, things you should be worried about. With mobile designs, it's the things I just mentioned to you. So how do you get around that? You use what's called responsive design. And the way we'll start to get around it will be by using media queries. All right. And then later on, we'll add something that's called Bootstrap, which is a framework to make it easier for you to use. But the idea, if you look up on the screen, please, and it's in your book. So there's the look on it on a desktop. There's the look on it on a tablet. Or there's a tablet, there's a phone. That's done using media queries. All right, and the chapter ends with, on pages 234 and 235, they give you a web design best practices checklist. Now, do you have to go through this? What I would suggest is when you are creating your own digital portfolio for the end of the semester. That's not due till like 2 days before the end of the semester. I think we're done the 21st. It's due like the 19th. All right. But I would look through this at the very end to see if you are, yeah, that's the way it's been set up, type of thing. All right. So for Chapter 5, I'm going to look. I want to double check. But to my knowledge, for Chapter 5, we just went over it. But you don't. There are no end of chapter exercises to do for Chapter 5. Nothing. All right. But we will have a written test on it on Friday. So tomorrow, when you come in here, we're going to do 2 things. We're going to go through 3 things, I'm sorry. I'm going to give you back your tests and quickly go over them, okay? That's the first thing. Second thing is we're going to go over a test review for Chapter 4. Then we're going to go over a test review for Chapter 5. That'll probably take approximately the first hour. And then you will have from about 9 o'clock till 11:55 for you to work on getting the homework done. All right? Then on Thursday, you will do the written test for Chapter 4 right when you get in here. Okay? After you do that, I'm not going to go over Chapter 6. I'll go over it on Friday. I want to have people have enough time. But on Friday, we're going to spend most of the period. Unless you decide you'd rather have it on Thursday, it's up to you. Chapter 6 is probably the hardest chapter in the book, the one that we will cover next, believe it or not. It says the CSS box model, but it's all on page layout. It's how to set up layouts with 1 column or 2 columns or 3 columns, etc. You will have several exercises, external ones, that I will give you for that. I'll try to remember to run those off today so I can give those to you tomorrow. Then you can look at them tomorrow and say, hey, Jeff, I want you to lecture on Chapter 6 on Thursday, or Jeff, I want you to lecture on Chapter 6 on Friday. It's up to you. All right? And that's good, because then after only 2 weeks, we'll be through 6 chapters of the book. We'll slow it down. All right? Next week, we'll do 7 and 8, then 9 and 10, then 11 and 12, then 13 and 14. Okay? By that time, we're done. It's almost halfway through the class, and then we start on the other book. So if you don't have that other book, which is called JavaScript 6th edition, then you'll have to buy that by, I don't know, early to mid-October, whenever the heck that is. Questions on anything we went over today? All right, the rest of the period then is yours.